Okay, hello and welcome to the third meeting of the Turba online discussion group on the history of alchemy, broadly defined. I'm Jo Hedesan from University of Oxford, the organizer of the Turba, and I am pleased to introduce today's session on English alchemy. We are fortunate to have with us Dr. Stephen Clucas from Birkbeck, University of London, who will be chairing this session, which includes talks by Zoe Skretti from University of Birmingham and Sara Norja from University of Turku. Now, before I begin, I will just give some quick administrative matters. If you can keep your video on, the sound off. And I will also be broadcasting through YouTube, and you can ask questions there in the chat box. The meeting should be a maximum of 1.5 hours. And finally, a quick thank you to the Society of the History of Alchemy and Chemistry, which is providing its Zoom and YouTube account for our use. So please, Stephen, if you would like to take over at this point.
Absolutely. Thank you, Jo. It gives me a great deal of pleasure to chair this session today. Two researchers. We're getting research fresh hot off the alchemical press, if you like, or an alchemical distillate straight from the flask. And first of all, I'd like to introduce Sara Norja. Sara is a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Turku, Finland. She successfully defended her doctoral dissertation in 2021 on the Manuscript and Printed Witnesses of the Mirror of Alchemy. She is currently writing a book on the history of alchemy in Finnish. Her talk today, Translating Alchemy in Manuscript and Print, Speculum alchemiae to the Mirror of Alchemy, discusses the results of her doctoral dissertation with a special focus on the importance of translation in alchemy. Sara.
Thank you so much, Stephen. I'm going to share my screen now. There we go. And now you should all be able to see this. Are you all fine with it?
Yeah.
Obligatory check. Thank you. Okay, so let's go. Yeah. So actually, whoop. There we go. Yeah, Stephen basically already said a lot about my alchemical background. So yeah, I defended my dissertation last year. That is the very long-winded name of the dissertation. And there's also a link to the online version. So it's available for free at my university's website. Even just Googling it will get you there. So yeah, my approach to alchemy is through philology or historical linguistics, which isn't as common perhaps as some other approaches like history or literature, but I'm doing my best to champion using alchemical texts and alchemical material in historical linguistics. And my specialty is specifically the history of English. So that's what my studies have been on. And currently I am, as Stephen said, writing a nonfiction book in Finnish on the history of alchemy. So it's also been very interesting to come to these Turba presentations and hear a lot about all sorts of alchemical things. So that book is like a sort of very attempt to put all of the research I did for background stuff in my PhD into one book that I didn't actually end up putting in my PhD because there was too much of it. But as we know, alchemy is an endlessly fascinating subject. So firstly, a tiny bit about the sort of background for my dissertation. So my dissertation includes a scholarly edition of the Mirror of Alchemy. I became especially interested in alchemical texts from the point of view of textual studies and such things, because there are very few editions of English language alchemical texts, even though there's a huge amount of material available. So I got inspired by this when I started out on my PhD, and basically managed to create an edition during that PhD as one of my sort of results. Now, this is something that I've approached from a linguistic background, but I think that accurate editions of historical texts are also important for everyone else, even though linguists are the most likely ones to be interested in, you know, whether this word is actually spelt the exact same way as it was in the original manuscript. But basically, editions matter. They're especially important for studying language history, and especially since alchemy has been studied so little from the point of view of history of language, even though alchemical texts can be a really interesting example of the history of science and scientific language in English. I feel that we should have more historical alchemical editions, because currently there's only around 8 editions of alchemical prose texts in English, which is really not much considering how much material there is. But one of the reasons there aren't that many is just that linguists haven't really approached alchemical texts because they've probably felt a bit intimidated in the past, because as I've also noticed, in order to edit alchemical text properly, you do need to absorb a lot of the context around alchemy. You need to know about the theories and all the terms and everything. And it is quite complicated, but I do feel people should do more of this, and I hope more people do. And then another sort of more theoretical thing before I get to talking about the actual Mirror of Alchemy. So my dissertation focused a lot on the concept of vernacularization, which in this case basically means the slow transfer from Latin to English as a language of science, or the predominant language of science. So especially from the 15th century onwards, scientific texts in England began to be transmitted also in English in addition to Latin, and there's been a lot of research on what this has meant for medical texts, but not so much on alchemy. So yeah, especially the 15th to 17th centuries were very important for the language of science shifting from predominantly Latin to predominantly English. And the Mirror of Alchemy reflects this as well. And another thing that is important for early English scientific texts is translation. And this has been largely neglected in a lot of linguistic and textual research, especially. A lot of linguists study translations, but they don't really discuss them as translations or think about what it means that they are translations. And they're especially important for communicating scientific information. So as we know, through the history of alchemy, translation has been a huge thing, and it's been essential for transmitting alchemical information. And transmitting the information from Latin to English is no exception. And now let's move on to my actual material. So my dissertation was on the Mirror of Alchemy, MOA, as I've abbreviated it in the slides. This is probably a familiar name to people who are familiar with alchemical historiography, because it is a reasonably well-known alchemical work. So it's an alchemical treatise with 7 chapters. It was attributed to Roger Bacon, who was a 13th century Franciscan scholar who got a lot of alchemical stuff attributed to him, even though he didn't really write that much on alchemy, and most of the works that have been attributed to him are pseudo-Baconian, or, you know, not really written by him. So the Mirror of Alchemy, which in its original Latin is referred to usually as Speculum alchemiae, So the Mirror of Alchemy, Speculum alchemiae, was written by some anonymous person, but they wanted to sound more believable and decided to attribute it to Roger Bacon. So the primary material in my dissertation consists of 7 manuscript copies of the Mirror of Alchemy from the 15th to 17th centuries, as well as a printed copy from 1597, a printed edition, sorry, which you can see a picture of the title page on the slide. Now, this printed edition has been edited in 1992 by Stanton Linden, but the manuscripts have been previously ignored pretty much entirely. And in fact, these manuscript copies also evidence that there are previous translations in English before the printed edition. And I'll talk more about the 4 textual groups a bit later, but basically the Mirror of Alchemy can be divided into 4 different translations. And my dissertation includes an edition, as I've said, of one of these translations, which is only in manuscript. So a little intro to what the Mirror of Alchemy contains. I won't really be talking too much about this content, but I think it's just interesting to note that it is basically something that I call Alchemy 101. So it pretty much explains the alchemical process. So there's usually some kind of prefatory material, a preface or prologue, not in all witnesses, but most of the time. And then there's 7 chapters, proceeding sort of from the more theoretical in chapters 1 to 3 to the more practical chapters 4 onwards. So as you can see, there's some very basic alchemical stuff, the properties of the 7 metals, there's a lot of alchemical theory, what substance you should actually use, and how you actually achieve this great work. And there's even a recipe-like section at the end, so sort of describing how the Philosopher's Stone is actually made. However, I should note that I have studied this text in great detail, but it still is unclear enough that I have not found out A, what the actual substance is that you should start with, or B, how to actually make the Philosopher's Stone. So the Mirror of Alchemy does do that alchemical thing of not being entirely transparent, even though the treatise definitely claims to be, you know, very comprehensible and, you know, even a simpleton could understand it. But I'm probably a simpleton because I have not understood the entirety of alchemy through this treatise. Nevertheless, so now briefly just on the Latin Speculum alchemiae, which it's based on. So there are 35 manuscript copies that I've been able to identify. There is no scholarly edition of this Latin work, which made my work a whole lot harder because I basically had to do research on the Latin tradition while also doing research on the English tradition. However, there are, from what I've been able to gather, this many copies. 19 of them are in the UK, and I, pre-pandemic, was able to view 18 of them in person and one of them digitally. So I've seen all of the UK manuscripts and was able to use pictures of them for my analysis and comparison. I didn't do a very in-depth textual comparison of the Latin and English, but on a structural level, I was able to look at things. And just as a note on the sort of importance of this treatise, having 35 surviving manuscript copies does indicate quite an interest in this treatise. For instance, Irma Davidsainen has compared Latin manuscripts of a medical treatise and considered that 33 manuscripts is a pretty wide transmission. So I would say that this was a fairly broadly transmitted alchemical treatise in Latin. And yeah, even the Latin version can be, or the Latin work can be divided into at least 2 textual traditions. So there's different kind of versions going on. And now a little look at how the Mirror of Alchemy, the English Mirror of Alchemy, compares to sort of general trends in English alchemical or scientific writings in general. So like I've said, translation is important, and it is pretty significant that the Mirror of Alchemy is a translation in the first place. So it wasn't written in English, and originally it was translated from Latin. This is very common for alchemical texts from what I've been able to gather from a lot of the archival research I've done. It was also attributed to a famous scholar, which if you've studied medieval texts, you know that that's basically extremely common for medieval things in general, and alchemy is no exception. The first manuscripts of the Mirror of Alchemy are from the 15th century, which does kind of fit in nicely with the sort of timeline of vernacularization, so the transfer from Latin to English for English scientific writings. Also, what I think is a really interesting part of the Mirror of Alchemy is how it shows the continuity of medieval alchemy in the early modern period. So a medieval alchemical text like this one was still being copied and studied in the 16th and 17th centuries. So it shows that these sort of alchemical theories and interests weren't quite that different. I know I'll quickly just point out that the Mirror of Alchemy subscribes to the mercury sulfur theory of the formation of metals. So there's like a very basic alchemical theory going on there as well. And now let's look a bit closer at the witnesses. Please don't be horrified by this massive table. I just kind of want to give you an overview of the actual material. So, like I've said, the witnesses kind of span around 200 years, which is pretty great for a historical linguist, because I get to look at language change as well. Mostly English libraries, but also Copenhagen, interestingly. As you can see, there are 2 copies in the same manuscript, and I will soon reveal that these are actually different versions. So it wasn't just the same scribe copying the exact same thing in the same manuscript. And the last manuscript in this list from Amsterdam is actually not part of my PhD material. And this is because it used to belong to a private owner, and I was not able to access it during my PhD. Last year, or maybe very late 2020, just when I was revising my PhD, I got news that it was actually now in the University Library of Amsterdam again, which is great, and I want to be able to look at it again, but also wasn't able to use it in my PhD. So that's unfortunate, but that's how it goes sometimes with manuscript scholarship. So yeah, here is a little figure with the different translations. So I've said there's 4 translations, and I'll soon look at them in a bit more detail. But basically, they all derive from some unknown Latin manuscript, and we can't know which one without some extremely good luck and amazing skills in Latin. So ST here means source text, which is the sort of, in translation studies, the text that you translate from, and TT is target text, so the text that gets translated from it. And yeah, this is what I've been able to uncover. So the 2 first groups, as I'll soon discuss, are only in manuscript, and they're, it's unclear what their antecedents are. It's pretty hard to say. Group 3 must originally be from some Latin manuscript, but then there was a Latin printed edition and then a French one. And then that led to the English translation. And the group 4 also has a printed source text. But I'll discuss all of these in a bit more detail in just a moment. So the first group, there are 5 manuscript witnesses. But as mentioned, one of them I wasn't able to use. This is a pretty textually unified group. It has the same information content, it has the same structure with some pretty interesting things in the structure. Like there's some very, very detailed information given in very useful ways. And yeah, this was the main focus of my edition. So I've worked on these a lot. So yeah, they vary in terms of the level of, actual words, but that's basically normal for every medieval text. So you can still see that they're the same version. And then the second group, I've just called it manuscript translation without prologue, because it does not have a prologue. There's only one manuscript of this, and my research has shown that it was translated from a different version of Speculum alchemiae compared to group 1. So there's a lot of difference in information content. So there's like fewer details, just way less stuff. This is much shorter than the other groups as well. Then the third group, consisting of the 1597 printed edition and a copy of it in manuscript. As you could see in the figure earlier, this group has a more complex translation history. So French is basically the bridge language between Latin and English in this group. So first it's a manuscript in Latin. That manuscript, whichever it might be, is used for the printed edition in De Alchemia, which is like one of the first alchemical compendium printed editions. Then the French decided they want to print Le Mirror of Alchemy, and that gets done. So my research showed that the English printed edition is definitely translated from the French. They're almost identical. It was very clear when I was comparing the two. And interestingly, the manuscript version only copies the first 3 chapters and no preface. The manuscript in question is some alchemist's commonplace book. So it looks like this person was just not that interested in the rest of the treatise. Maybe they just wanted to copy the theoretical stuff without any of the other things that they considered useless, perhaps. And finally, the fourth group is translated from an alchemical compendium, Theatrum Chemicum, which is also probably familiar to a lot of you. So there is only one manuscript witness of this as well, from the 17th century. And it was translated from the 1613 volume 2 of Theatrum Chemicum. So this was a massive compendium of alchemical texts published by Lazarus Setzner and later his sons or whoever they were. And the really interesting thing about this is that it looks like it might be the scribe's own translation, because it's very clearly translated from Theatrum Chemicum, because the same manuscript that this version is in has some other items that have been translated from Theatrum Chemicum, and those items have attributions Like, for instance, there's a note saying, concerning sulfur in the 4th volume of the Theatrum Chemicum, page 360. So thank you, scribe. You can't really get much clearer than that in seeing where this person got their sources. This is pretty rare, honestly. I feel a lot of alchemists just don't attribute their sources because it just wasn't the way. So yeah, this, in my analysis, is clearly translated from the Latin, Theatrum Chemicum, but even though this does seem like it could be the scribe's own translation, the syntax is very natural to English. It's not too influenced by Latin. However, there is Latin influence in vocabulary, and I'll look a bit at vocabulary in a moment. But this version is definitely the outlier in that also non-technical vocabulary is very, very Latin. So things like enigma, where the others would use secret, and coronated, where the others would use crowned. And since I compared this with the Latin in Theatrum Chemicum, it was very obvious that these correspond to the exact terms, words that were used in the Latin. And another question is, was the translator here in the 17th century aware of the 1597 version? It's possible, because the printed edition was obviously more broadly available than some random manuscript. But there's no evidence either way, so we can't really know if this was a translation exercise by someone who knew that there's already an English translation of the Mirror of Alchemy, or was it just because they didn't know that anything existed? Oh, a final note about the Latin vocabulary. Something that might also explain this in part is because in the 17th century in England, it was really fashionable to use Latin influenced vocabulary in your writing, so it might mean nothing more than that. And now, I've been talking a lot about these texts. Let's finally show you some. Now, I hope that these don't look dreadfully alien, but the first one is from the 15th century Cambridge manuscript. Second one is from a 16th century manuscript. The third one is from the printed edition from 1597. And the last one is from the 17th century manuscript in group 4. So I'll get into the details in a moment, but for now, just overall, I wanted to say that I hope that you can see, sort of even in this short extract, that the work, the Mirror of Alchemy, is basically the same in all of these witnesses, but I think it is pretty obvious that these 4 versions or 4 translations are distinct. So here I've just bolded a few words that I'd like us to look at. So in the first group, it says, despise not the ashes. So this is talking about, the alchemical process and, what the various stages look like. So yeah, group 1, despise not the ashes. Group 2 phrases this, set not short by thine ashes. Group 3, do not set light by the ashes. And then, very tellingly, group 4, estim the ashes. So there's that Latin, very obvious influence. Yeah, and then there's the crowned word, then shall a king be crowned with a red diadem. The king shall be crowned with a diadem of red. And then group 3, the king is invested with a red crown. And group 4, the king is coronated with a red diadem. So these are all saying the same thing in terms of information content, but they're saying it in very different ways. And some of these differences are also explained by language change over time. So as I've mentioned, there's almost 200 years between the first and the last of these groups. So these happen to actually correspond nicely to a chronological order as well. So yeah, some of these things can be explained by language change, but overall, they are just different translations, different ways of saying the same thing. And they definitely seem to reflect a lack of knowledge about the previous translations. So obviously with manuscripts, you just don't have access to all of them. And as a sort of final linguistic thing, one of the things I was looking at in my dissertation is basically how alchemical information in the Mirror of Alchemy is processed and transmitted through words, because I'm a linguist. So I looked at alchemical terminology in chapter 3 of the Mirror of Alchemy, because chapter 3 is really long, so it was a good thing to use for analysis. So basically, all of these translations have a sort of common pool of alchemical terminology. And there's two main word formation strategies. So firstly, loanwords from Latin or Latin through French. And these are used especially for specialized terms. So words like decoction, fiction, projection. And then another thing is native English non-alchemical words were modified in meaning for alchemy. So this was a major thing here. Also, wow, I'm amazingly repeating myself on the slide. That's just for emphasis, surely. So yeah, loanwords, native terms, that's sort of the main division. But the loanwords are definitely the more precise terms. So many of the really central alchemical terms were part of the English language already in the 15th century, such as elixir, sulfur, fiction, such things. So basically, the scribes and translators were transmitting alchemical terminology into English through translation. And so they're using loanwords from languages that already had these alchemical concepts, very precise alchemical concepts. So they're just trying to figure out, how do I say this in English? And I do think that one of the main motivators for these borrowings is a desire for precision. And also, yeah, native terms were used to kind of expand to encompass alchemical meanings as well, such as our old familiar stone for the philosopher's stone, lapis philosophorum. There are no radical changes in alchemical terminology from the 15th to the 17th century. This is, like I've mentioned, because a lot of the very central terms were part of the English language already fairly early on in alchemy. But also, obviously, these are all translations of the Mirror of Alchemy, so that might explain some of the similarities. And now finally, just a sort of summary of the contributions that my dissertation has given. So I've used methods from scholarly editing and textual studies to research alchemical texts, which hasn't been done a lot previously, and I think should be done more. So we need linguists to be able to access alchemical material, but also so that historians can access it. A major finding was the uncovering of the textual relationships of the Mirror of Alchemy. So as I've discussed in this presentation, all the 4 groups and how they relate to each other, and the fact that they are 4 translations that do differ in structure somewhat and a bit in terms of information content, but they are the same work. And the Mirror of Alchemy is also a great example of the vernacularization of science in the terms of the science of alchemy through translation. So like I said, loanwords, and then extending the semantic reach of so-called ordinary daily life words. And also my dissertation contains a scholarly edition of Group 1, so that's the 15th century manuscript version. So other scholars can now use the Mirror of Alchemy in their work, whether that be linguistic or historical or something else. And I also included transcriptions of the other group's texts in my dissertation so that the full history of the work can be included. Thank you so much, and I do hope that I haven't been too linguistic. Please feel free to ask me at the end of today's session if there's anything that is terribly confusing about this all. Thank you so much, and I will now stop sharing.
Thank you very much indeed, Sarah, for sharing the results of your research with us. I'm sure there'll be some questions later on. We're going to take questions at the end of this session after the second paper. So now let me go straight on to introduce Zoe Skretti. Zoe is a doctoral candidate at the University of Birmingham. She's just handed in her PhD thesis, in fact. She submitted in February this year, and in that thesis she explores the relationship between religious reform and alchemy in England between 1450 and 1650. So we're on similar terrain to Sara's thesis, really. Beyond her thesis, Zoe is lead editor of the Midlands Historical Review and is postgraduate officer for the British Society for the History of Science. Her talk today, Reformed Responses to Genesis in Early Modern Alchemical Treatises, draws on research from a chapter of her doctoral thesis and explores the changing ways in which alchemists engaged with scripture over the course of the Protestant Reformation. Zoe, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Stephen. Just share my screen. Great, an obligatory screen check. Can everyone see that?
Yep.
Fantastic. So the Book of Genesis provided a key textual intersection between alchemical theory and Christian theology in both the medieval and early modern periods, as its discussions of the processes of God's creation of the world could be read alchemically as a description of the opus magnus. This paper seeks to explore the relationship between Genesis and alchemical theory in medieval and early modern England, examining in particular the ways in which Reformed alchemists from the 1560s onward, many of whom were conformist Calvinists, used and responded to the first book of the Bible to inform their alchemical thoughts and practices. The first section of this paper explores the application of exegetical methods used to understand the Bible to alchemical theory, and it will be argued that as Reformed readings of the Bible grew increasingly literal, so too did understandings of Genesis as an explicitly alchemical process emerge. The second section of this paper then explores the ramifications of these more literal readings of Genesis in alchemical treatises, questioning how and why literal readings of Genesis shaped attitudes towards the very role of the alchemist and the limits of the alchemist's abilities. So during the Protestant Reformation, scholars forewent the fourfold method of reading and interpreting texts that had been popular in the medieval period, known as quadriga, and turned instead to a more literal and direct analytical approach. And this alteration in methods of exegesis was also felt in alchemical treatises, and in particular with regards to explorations of Genesis. And Debus notably argued that the first chapter of Genesis provided a key link between the Bible and nature for early modern Paracelsians. But Genesis also provided a key point of synthesis much earlier in the medieval period too, and was being used as early as the 13th century by alchemical authors to unite explorations of alchemy, nature, and Christianity. So a version of Pseudo-Geber's Testamentum transcribed in Sloane Manuscript 320 under the English title The Testament of Geber noted, for example, that in Genesis in the first chapter, God saying, "Let us make no man to our likeness," he did not create that man alone, so that there should be none joined unto him in the world. No more he will not, that can be done of one only multiplication, but if his like be joined unto him. As William Newman has suggested, this text likely represents one of the false Geberiana, which was probably written in the Latin West in the 13th century and was later transcribed by the 16th century compiler of Sloane Manuscript 320. As such, the original author would have been firmly situated in a medieval Christian context and thus expounded Western Christian ideas. So Pseudo-Geber takes the creation of man here, as described in Genesis, and interprets the scripture in an allegorical sense, likening the creation of man to the alchemical process of multiplication, and thereby reinforcing the key alchemical theory of like multiplying only with like. The union of Adam and Eve is not presented here as a literal description of alchemical multiplication, but rather a very neat comparative. Pseudo-Geber's parallels were echoed by another medieval pseudepigraphic work, this time a treatise by Pseudo-Roger Bacon, which explores the philosopher's stone. This treatise is framed as a dialogue between father and son, in which the father instructs the son in alchemical matters. The father uses the creationary process described in Genesis to allegorically explain that all things are created out of water. He remarks, "Know that before the creation of the world, the spirit of the dead was carried upon the waters, as it said in Genesis. Therefore it seemeth unto us that all things are created of the water." Just as in the Pseudo-Geberian treatise, Pseudo-Bacon does not claim that the movement of the spirit over the water is an overtly alchemical process, but rather an allegory which could be employed to explain the need for alchemists to extract water from all bodies during the alchemical process. George Ripley, the notorious canon of Bridlington, also drew upon the synthesis between Genesis and alchemical theory in the 15th century in his preface to the Compound of Alchemy. Here Ripley notes that in the beginning, when thou madest all of naught and globish matter, and dark under confusion, by the beginner marvellously was wrought, containing materially all thing without division, of which thou made in 6 days clear distinction, as Genesis aptly doth record. So again, Ripley is using the creation of the world not as a literal alchemical process, but rather a convenient allegory, used to encourage the alchemists to harness the chaos of in their alembics, just as God had harnessed the dark confusion during the creation. For such authors then, the Bible was not an explicitly alchemical treatise to be read for instruction, but rather a source of comparisons and allegories, which enabled alchemists to better understand and explain the processes of their art. But this all changed in the 16th and 17th centuries, as the Protestant notion of sola scriptura grew to prominence, and contemporary scholarship forewent the quadriga in favour of much more literal and direct interpretations. In his 1612 the Silver Watchman, the English Paracelsian Puritan minister Thomas Tim, for example, noted that in Moses' commentary on Genesis, he tells us that the Spirit of God moved upon the water, which was ingested chaos or masses created by God, confused earth in mixture, yet by his alchemical extraction, separation, sublimation, and conjunction, so ordered and conjoined again as they are manifestly seen apart and sundered. So Tim's use of Genesis here sits in very stark contrast to the uses of Genesis employed by Pseudo-Geber and Pseudo-Bacon and Ripley, as he posits God directly in the role of the alchemist. The creationary process outlined in Genesis is, Tim professes, no mere comparative, but rather an explicit example of alchemical experimentation at play, albeit at a macrocosmic level. Tim then has moved beyond allegorical interpretations of Genesis to instead suggest that the first book of the Bible explicitly depicts God's alchemical prowess. Other Reformed alchemists also took this more literal approach to Genesis. Humphrey Locke, a Protestant Elizabethan alchemist and statesman, likewise noted that, as it is said in the book of Genesis, God made the firmament and departed water from water, And he goes on to claim that this is an explicit example of the alchemical process of separation. So again, he's using Genesis not as a convenient allegory, but rather a literal depiction of alchemical processes such as separation. This reformed approach to Genesis, which saw it become a literal and explicit example of macrocosmic alchemy, and which posited God in the role of the alchemist, proved to be pervasive and was even adopted by those who were not themselves alchemists. John Milton, for example, adopted such an approach in his Paradise Lost. In this work, the archangel Raphael describes the first day of creation, during which God separates and purifies matter before casting unformed matter into a globe which is warmed, purging away the dross. He writes, "Darkness profound covered the abyss, but on the watery calm his brooding wings the Spirit of God outspread, throughout the fluid mass, but downward purged the black Tartarus cold infernal dregs adverse to life, then founded, then conglobed like things to like." Although not himself an alchemist, Milton explores Genesis here in explicitly alchemical ways, just as Locke and Tim had done. By employing alchemical terminology, Milton transmuted Genesis into a practical alchemical text, finding within it not only a narrative of the creation of the world, but also an explicit alchemical process, which a budding alchemist could follow on a microcosmic level in their own laboratories. As the Reformation introduced new methods of exegesis then, approaches to Genesis within alchemical treatises shifted. Gone were the allegorical interpretations of the medieval period, and in their place, newer, more literal interpretations grew to prominence. Consequently, God himself came to be posited in the role of master alchemist, creating the world through macrocosmic chemical means. If an alchemist wanted to do the same on a microcosmic level within their alembics, they need only consult Genesis to discover the true ordering of the alchemical processes. Though the ways in which Genesis was interpreted differed according to predominant methods of exegesis, discussions of the creationary process underwent an additional shift in the post-Reformation period, a shift which ultimately resulted in the alchemists being given greater agency to directly manipulate their alchemical substances. So, as I'm sure you're all aware, in the book of Genesis, God gives the world unto man so that man may assert their dominance over it. Peter Harrison has noted that medieval readings of this assertion of man's dominance in Genesis encouraged natural philosophers to strive for their own inward dominion. As such, man's dominion over nature was seen as an introspective process in which an individual attempted to harness their own mental beasts rather than the literal flora and fauna of the natural world. In taming their internal green lions, alchemists would be able to reach the verdant pastures of alchemical wisdom. With this allegorical approach in mind, pre-Reformation alchemists tended to view their role as one of discovery rather than creation. They were uncovering hidden truths buried by God rather than asserting their own dominance over the natural world. In large part, this rested on the belief that substances contained a seed buried within them, which had been planted by God and which would allow their multiplication. Michael Scott, for instance, noted in his 13th century Curious Questions about the nature of the sun and the moon that God is true one only creator, which hath sown in things the causes and reasons seminary that is of seed. Likewise, Pseudo Geber remarked in his Secreta Secretorum that man will retain the multiplication of seed forever, so is it our purpose. So for both Scott and Pseudo Geber then, nature was laced with secret seeds, placed there by God, which were both essential to the nature of substances themselves and which enabled their multiplication. In discovering these buried seeds or essences within nature through their art, alchemists could thus attain both a true understanding of the natural world and the ability to multiply substances. With such understandings in mind, alchemists viewed their role as one of discovery. Certainly, they were using their art to imitate and hasten nature, but their ultimate quest was to purify a substance down to its essential core to attain the hidden secrets buried within by God. These ideas of the alchemist as discoverer proved to be enduring ones. The monk and poet John Lydgate noted in his 15th century translation of Secretorum, for instance, that in herb and flower, in writing, word and stone, each hath his virtue of God and of nature, but the knowing is hid from many one, and not declared to every creature. So here the emphasis is really placed on knowledge, and the author sort of claims that the secrets of alchemical wisdom would be revealed to only a select few, i.e. those who attained their own minds and were thus receptive to such knowledge. That the alchemist's role was one of discovery rather than creation per se is confirmed later in the text, where it stated, "It concordeth well to search out scripture, mysteries hid of fowls, beast, and tree, and of angels most subtle of nature, of minerals and fishes in the sea, and of stones specially of three, one mineral, other vegetative, parted on four to length a man's life." Again, as before, there is the sense that God has laced nature with secrets, which the alchemist must discover if they hope to attain the stone specially of three. Having subdued the wilderness of their own minds, an alchemist could hope to have the prelaxarian knowledge of God's creation, or nature, revealed to them, not in order to create, but rather to sort of understand. 15th century alchemist Thomas Norton similarly argued that alchemists should not attempt to create, but rather discover, in his 1477 Ordinal of Alchemy. So in this treatise, Norton notes that God conjunctions man may not undo, and later that faces of elements be knit with a knot of God his hand, that they may not depart by none engine, nay craft of man's hand, art. So Norton thus warns the alchemists that they should not attempt to tamper with God's creation, as he had bound all elements in a knot that no man could undo. Norton thereby reaffirms the notion that alchemists were supposed to uncover rather than create. They didn't necessarily have dominion over the world, laced as it was with God's secrets, but were rather seeking to purify substances down to their essential seeds and thereby truly understand them. If they could tame their own minds, they could attain the knowledge that they sought, and their role was as such one of understanding as opposed to creation or dominion. Now again, this begins to change in the 16th and 17th centuries as alchemists began to apply increasingly literal interpretations to scripture, as we've already seen. Increasingly literal Protestant readings of scripture removed the allegorical and symbolic meanings given to Genesis in the medieval period, resulting in an approach which ascribed to alchemists far greater dominion over the natural world than they'd enjoyed previously. No longer were alchemists merely grappling with their own minds, but rather the material world. So in direct contrast to Thomas Norton, for example, Scryer, alchemist and associate of John D. Edward Kelly, noted in his 1590 work that he that can earth fastness once and bind shall quickly know that I the truth have told. So Kelly uses the same imagery here of elemental knots that Norton had done, but conversely suggests that such knots should be unbound, ascribing to alchemists a degree of dominion over nature in their experiments that's entirely lacking in Norton's Ordinal. Whilst Norton argued that alchemists should uncover rather than unbind, Kelly instead claimed that it was the role of the alchemist to undo nature's knots, thereby asserting their own dominion. The contrasting approaches of these two authors thus indicates some sort of shift in attitudes towards the abilities of the alchemist. Thomas Rawlin, a physician-surgeon who was also a keen alchemist, also commented on this changed attitude in 1611, arguing that the omnipotent God in the rotten mass, as it were in a chaos, to be despised, to us mortals has left all things, and thus that the role of the alchemist was not merely to uncover, but to unuse. So Rawlin very explicitly draws upon Genesis 1:28-30 here, in which God gives all things unto man, and argues in favour of alchemists asserting their own dominion. God had given man this power, and it was up to the alchemists to harness and actively use it. And Paracelsus likewise employed a literal interpretation of Genesis, arguing that alchemists had total dominion over substances because God had given man that right. He noted, "Man is able by the wise and witty industry of the art of alchemy to make an unprofitable thing profitable. For the scripture saith that God hath given all created things subject unto man." Though most likely not a Protestant himself, Paracelsus was writing for both Reformed audiences and Reformed patrons, and his literal interpretation of Genesis here certainly aligns with the new approaches of Reformed alchemists towards Genesis. Perhaps most interestingly, such notions were taken up in a further text, this time an anonymous late 16th century English poem titled Experience and Philosophy. This poem, framed as a conversation between the author, the Princess Philosophy, and the Princess Experience, outlines alchemical processes, concluding with a discussion of creation, which, though paraphrasing Genesis, never explicitly mentions the scripture. So the character of Experience exclaims, "For when my being was alone, one thing I made when there was none, a mass confused, darkly clad, and from that lump divided I 4 sundry elements, whom I commanded for to reign in diverse regiment. In kind they did agree, but not in quality. I made the starry sky so round with living bodies on the ground, and blessed them infinitely with life and long prosperity, and bade them grow and multiply." So Experience here is very clearly describing God's creation of the world as depicted in Genesis, noting, for example, that all things were made of one dark mass, that she had given life to all things, and that man had been told to multiply. And she further likens her work to that of God in Genesis in a succeeding stanza, in which she states that she has a son who sacrificed himself to bring light to the world, just as Christ had done via his crucifixion. Experience is thus portrayed as a godlike figure, responsible for the creation of the world. Yet at the same time, she's also portrayed as a master alchemist, harnessing chaos to imbue substances with life enough to multiply before eventually producing a bright shining substance through the process of putrefaction. The stories told in Genesis thus form the blueprint for her alchemical experimentation, with Experience's alchemical methodology explicitly mimicking the divine creation. This poem thus again shows the shift towards more literal interpretations of the Bible as an alchemical treatise in the 16th century. However, it's also indicative of the changing relationship that alchemists had to their own role and authority. It's not God or scripture that has authority in this poem, but rather experience, suggesting that it was the alchemist who, through their own practical experiments, had the skill and the authority to manipulate substances in a way that echoed God's manipulation of matter during the creation. No longer were they merely uncovering the hidden secrets buried within materials by God, but rather following his example to exert dominance over the natural world. In using experience as their central authority then, the author of Experience and Philosophy thus demonstrated the changing role of the alchemist in Reformation England. No longer were alchemists merely uncovering hidden seeds, they were now manipulating and creating. So these examples, just a handful of many, are indicative of a shift in attitudes occurring during the Reformation towards the role of the alchemist. Whereas pre-Reformation alchemists sought to tame their own minds and thereby attain hidden secrets or knowledge, Reformed alchemists instead strove to assert their dominance over the natural world, being shored up by literal readings of Genesis. In a worldview where man had literal dominion over the natural world, alchemists were better able to posit themselves in the role of creator rather than merely discoverer. Genesis then provided English alchemists with a key point of synthesis between their art and the Bible across both the early modern and medieval periods. However, the ways in which Reformed alchemists used and responded to the first book of the Bible was markedly different to that of their non-Reformed counterparts, resulting in shifts in not only the use of the Bible as an alchemical guidebook of sorts, but also the very ways in which the role of the alchemist was viewed. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Zoe. It's a very rich paper. Thank you both. So let me begin, whilst people are mustering their forces and questions, either in the chat or by putting a hand up, by asking each of you a question to begin with, starting with Sara. And my question to you, Sara, is about the attribution of the Mirror of Alchemy to Roger Bacon. And I wondered when this starts. Is it something which only happens with the 16th century printed edition, or do we find attributions to Roger Bacon in the 15th century manuscripts that you mentioned?
Yeah, thank you. That is a really interesting question, and something that I looked at a lot also in my PhD. So it is also an earlier attribution. And actually, interestingly, in the English copies of the Mirror of Alchemy, there are actually no direct attributions to Roger Bacon in the 15th century ones. However, when I looked at the Latin manuscripts that I was able to look at, which was, a fair few, I discovered that there were a couple of 15th century ones where there was clearly an attribution to Roger Bacon in the original scribe's hand. So the attribution does seem to have arisen pretty much at the sort of early stages of the whole treatise, because the treatise was, supposedly written by Bacon, but it was probably written sometime in the early 15th century by some anonymous person writing in Latin. But yeah, the attribution shows up surprisingly early, but it does seem to be more sort of widespread towards the early modern period. So in one of the medieval manuscripts of the Mirror of Alchemy, so in English, someone writing in a later hand has written Speculum alchemiae, Roger Bacon, in the margins. So it seems to be that it's sort of becoming more of a common attribution as time goes on, but it does appear earlier.
That's interesting. Thank you. I shall definitely go and check out your thesis online on that particular question.
Enjoy.
And Zoe, my question to you, I have two brief questions really. One is, and they're very kind of punctilious questions. You mentioned Pseudo Bacon talking about the spirit of the dead in Genesis. That seemed to me a remarkably odd notion, and I wondered if that crops up anywhere else. I can't say I've heard about the spirit of the dead in Genesis before. And the other thing was about Milton's Tartareus cold infernal dregs, which seems kind of counterintuitive, really. And I wondered if that was less to do with our, Tartarus and hell and the infernal we're associating, as Milton does, with kind of burning coals and so forth, but maybe to do more with the nature of Tartar as it was conceived by chemists at the time.
Yeah, thank you. Those are excellent questions. I haven't come across Spirit of the Dead anywhere other than the Pseudo Bacon text. So it would be really interesting to know quite what he's referring to. But it does seem to be something that's very specific to him. And yeah, the Milton's sort of seemingly very contrasting terms of Tartarus and cold is another really interesting point, and I think it possibly does have something, it's possibly more invested in the chemical theories than it is necessarily sort of more contemporary sense of the term. But I think as well it's sort of also, it's quite a nice sense of sort of the variety and the changeability of that state and that matter, and the fact that there are sort of two polar opposites combined into one. So I again would love to know more about why he specifically chose that, but I do wonder if it's sort of both invested in the chemical and also invested in this sense of changeability and instability and different qualities combined into one thing, which is something very alchemical.
Okay, that's great, thank you. I see we have one question already. John Christie, would you like to unmute?
Yes, can you hear me, Stephen?
Yes.
Okay, thank you both for very, very interesting papers. I have, for Sara, a couple of thoughts. Given that generally alchemy deploys so many cover names, decknamen, in a sense, you had an example in those four in the translations of the red crown or whatever. I just did wonder if you get that consistency, if there are a lot of decknamen in the work, that consistency of translations through your manuscript sequence. That was one thought. The other thought was just the term enigma, which you said meant secret. Now, might that have been, as it were, a translation of arcanum? Or, you see, the reason I ask is when I've seen that term used in the 17th century, I've seen it used as the word for something like an obscure allegory, something occluded and clouded in meaning, or even a riddle. So I was just wondering about what it is exactly that enigma translates. Yeah. And shall I ask my Zoe question now, or you carry on and reply?
I can reply. Yeah. Yes, thank you. Those are really interesting questions. So the decknamen question is really it's one of those things where one of the reasons why the Mirror of Alchemy was actually a surprisingly easy alchemical text to approach is because it doesn't actually use that many decknamen, and the ones it uses are fairly standard, like the whole red crown business. So there actually aren't that many at all in the whole treatise, but where they are, they're basically the same ones, and they are pretty much the same term or deckname in the different versions. But there really aren't that many. There's only like a couple of metaphors in the whole treatise, so it's very surprisingly technical in terms of just talking mostly about mercury and sulfur and stuff like that. Yeah, so there's not that many, but they are like they are used fairly consistently, the couple of them that there are. And as when it comes to enigma, so actually in this case, it does seem that the scribe is just looking at the Latin original, because in that precise position in Speculum alchemiae, the word used is enigma, which so it's literally just and I think I checked like that in Latin this just means secret, and it might of course have some like connotations that I'm just not familiar enough with, but I think that the scribe is just, you know, going like, okay, enigma, that's a word in English, I will use it. Because I don't know, I wouldn't call this scribe a lazy translator, but there are a lot of like, oh, this word exists in English and also is the same, so let's just use that.
So it's not in a translator's term, it's not a false friend.
No, not as such. No, it's just a very sort of literal use. Although it is used, like, I don't think enigma is like, usually enigma, even at that stage in English, did have some more sort of occult connotations. But I don't know. I haven't actually thought about this. Like maybe the scribe did have some wish to make it seem more occult by using this word, and maybe I should look into this, because individual words are always interesting. So thank you for pointing this out.
Okay, thanks so much. And for Zoe, this is more a kind of structural question for your whole approach, because what you say about with your examples from Protestant England, that comes through very clearly and very, very convincingly. Yeah. But my question is, what if there are examples of equivalent change in Catholic alchemy? Do you see what I mean? Say one, this is just hypothetical, say one looked at certain French Protestant alchemists, yeah, in the 16th century, which there definitely were, and compared them with their Catholic brothers in alchemy. Does the notion of reform discriminate and locate this change you are talking about, or is there some underlying change that might operate within Catholic cultures as well? Now, that's just a purely hypothetical rather than a critical question, Zoe. I just thought it might be of interest.
Yeah, thank you. That's a brilliant question. And it's something that I have been keen to look into as much as possible. Yeah, it certainly is in Van Helmont, and particularly in the more sort of Paracelsian circles, this starts coming through. But sort of beyond those Paracelsian circles, it does seem, from what I've seen, to be very limited to the more Protestant writings. But there is, of course, we have to bear in mind sort of underlying and backdrops of things like Renaissance and the idea of the self, and the sort of I think it's in Mirandola where he talks about sort of man having creative agency beyond God. So there are sort of other strands that are at play that we do also have to bear in mind, but there certainly does seem to be a very strong tendency for this to come through the Protestant writings in England at this period, beyond Paracelsian circles.
Okay, thanks very much, Zoe, and to Sara too. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you for your questions, John. We have another question, another hand up from Alexander Angerhofer. Alexander.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
So I have a question for Sara. It's interesting when you look at translation, there's always the chance that there are translation errors, especially when it comes to the chemistry. Do you know who actually did the translation? Maybe you said it and I missed it. And were these people that translated the original Latin into English alchemists themselves, or were they just people that translated a lot of stuff like the translation school in Spain, for example, that translated Arabic into Castilian and Latin?
Yep, thank you. That is a great question. And sadly, I basically haven't been able to find out almost anything about the different translators because these manuscripts are all anonymous. And there are a few contextual clues within the manuscripts themselves, but not a huge load. So the most, I've been able to sort of piece together some of the clues. So I think that pretty much everyone, all of the people who translated the groups 1 and 2, so the ones that are only in manuscript, I'm pretty sure they were alchemists themselves, because the texts appear in alchemical miscellanies, and it does seem like a fairly niche thing at that point, and there doesn't seem to be evidence of like a sort of school of alchemical translators in English. So I think it's just individual alchemists who are familiar, or who are like proficient in Latin and then want to transmit the information into English, possibly for the benefit of themselves so that they don't have to puzzle through the Latin every time, or for the benefit of alchemists who are not familiar with Latin. But they're all basically anonymous. So what I've been able to gather of the 16th century versions. The latest one, group 4, the one with the enigma, it's possible that that person was more like an antiquarian, because the manuscript that the Mirror of Alchemy is in is like very neat. There's a lot of alchemical text, but it doesn't seem to be a workbook of any sort. So it's always possible that this person was just interested in alchemy from a more theoretical point of view, and wasn't like an actual chemist themselves or anything like that. But yeah, disappointingly, there's very little evidence, so there's not much to say. But I do think that the original translators must have been alchemists, and from what I've been, like, I haven't done a word-for-word comparison with most of the Latin. I have kind of done a word-for-word comparison with the printed Latin from 1541 and the Theatrum Chemicum. So it does look like the alchemical content is the same. So there aren't any significant errors. So I do think that the translators would have been at least familiar with alchemy, if not alchemists themselves.
Thank you.
Hey, we have a hand up in the chat. Kate, would you like to unmute and ask your question?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yep.
Fab, thank you. I just had a question for Zoe. Thank you so much. I really enjoyed that paper. And I was just wondering if you could maybe say a bit more about how the trajectory you were tracing specifically maps onto the kind of rising popularity of alchemical medicine, and whether you thought Paracelsian medicine represents a kind of newfound confidence to kind of intervene in kind of the natural order of things, as it were. It was just this kind of shift from kind of alchemical discovery to kind of alchemical invention and kind of intervention was making me think of that kind of really amazing Oswald Kroll frontispiece in the Basilica Chemica, where you have that kind of correspondence being kind of visually mapped out between the kind of macrocosm kind of flowing down into the kind of microcosm of the alchemist's kind of earthly task. And then how that kind of gets picked up in a kind of later English alchemical medicine book by John Woodall, which kind of, instead of there being a kind of earthly sphere being represented, it's just kind of a picture of the physician himself. And I was just wondering if you could maybe, I'd just love to hear more about your thoughts, basically. Thank you.
Thank you. That's a fantastic question. I certainly think there's some really interesting links with the rise of Paracelsian thought and this newfound confidence of the alchemist. It's something that I look at a little bit in the final chapter of my thesis, is sort of how this rise of Paracelsianism is sort of playing into other trajectories in the religious sphere as well, and sort of looking particularly at Paracelsianism in Protestant contexts, which is sort of where a lot of this is coming through, with people like Thomas Tim, who sort of bridges that gap. And I think they're sort of two intertwined branches of one tree, and there are times when they cross over really nicely, but there are also times where they sort of diverge. So I do think that they're sort of feeding into one another, rather than it sort of being medicine is necessarily informing this rise, or alchemy is, sort of contributing to the rise in medicine. But certainly the ideas that are being expressed and the confidence in the ability of the alchemist to use their skill for good, and particularly for medicine. Certainly for Paracelsus, I think that comes into play with his sort of statements of dominion, in that he is, breaking these traditions, he's breaking these barriers and changing things. And I think you have to sort of do that with some degree of self-confidence if anyone's going to listen. So yeah, there's some really interesting links there between the sort of self-confidence in a way, and trying to project this new idea on the world, and trying to really make a change in terms of medicine through alchemical means. but to what extent it's sort of necessarily informing each other, I think is less certain.
Thank you so much. That's really interesting.
Okay, we have some interesting questions in the chat. Tom Fisher, I don't think, Tom, this is a question or a comment, but if you'd like to unmute to speak to your chat comment.
Hello, everyone. No, it was just a commentary. No, thank you for your presentation. It was very interesting. I personally working on the alchemical interpretation of the religious art and the religious architecture. So I think it's possible that there are parallels on. It's sure that there are parallels between alchemical interpretation of Genesis and so on, and of architecture. So I think I'm gonna send a message to Ms. Zoe Skretti to discuss this later.
Excellent, thanks, Tom. And I think our host, Jo, who runs this series, has a couple of questions. Jo, would you like to unmute?
Yes, well, I really enjoyed both presentations. I thought they were very interesting and very fresh new ideas being put forward. I guess one of my questions, I mean, what I was struck by was in Zoe's examples, how early these ideas of seeds of seminaria appear in alchemy. I mean, you mentioned Michael Scott and Pseudo-Geber. So I assume that these come from Augustine, I mean, from an Augustinian interpretation, which I find quite interesting that it's so early on that they would concentrate on Augustine as a source for this. And also, of course, the water in the Sloane 7023, it was also very interesting to me because obviously it appears in Van Helmont. And I've been just wondering now whether he might have had some access to this manuscript or something similar. I mean, yeah, my question is whether you think that I mean, these ideas came up in alchemy quite early. I mean, the idea of using Augustine. And also, if you know roughly, maybe you mentioned, but I missed it, what time Sloane 7023, how far back can you think that it was written? And I had, I mean, for Sara, I was just wondering, I mean, it's a very unrelated question, but I was wondering if there is any hope of producing a critical edition of, publishing one in, it seems like it would be a great idea of the Mirror of Alchemy and its sources.
Yeah, go ahead, Zoe.
Thanks. So yeah, it is really interesting that the idea of seeds comes through, and I think you're right in that it is coming from Augustinian thought. But I suppose a lot of sort of the evidence that we have for medieval alchemy is coming out of Augustinian monasteries or Franciscan monasteries. So it wouldn't necessarily be that unusual, I suppose, that if you have sort of Augustinian alchemists, that they would be receptive to these ideas of seeds and seminaries. And there is, of course, the possibility, and this is one that I would have to go back and look into further, that this is sort of a later edition by the transcriber, and that it's perhaps, I mean, Sarah's probably got more to say on this than me, but sort of maybe a linguistic change that sort of someone has chosen to do stylistically. But I do think it perhaps wouldn't have been that unusual in terms of how it's circulating in England and who is sort of taking on those ideas of seeds.
Yeah.
Sorry, just that question on the Sloane. I mean, basically, when you think it was authored, just if you can say a word or so.
Yes, sorry. So that manuscript, I think, is 16th century. So it is sort of a compilation of other earlier manuscripts. So yeah, I think it's 16th century, but I can check that.
And Sara, do you have plans for an edition?
Yeah, so my the dissertation that's online does contain the edition, but I do have plans of reaching out to a publisher to get the edition out, sort of broader distribution. I've been so busy with everything else that I haven't got to it yet, but I am planning to propose the edition, because I think it would be great to have like a sort of, I could do like a more concise introduction, and then, you know, have it be more accessible using the results from my PhD. So yeah, I'm definitely interested in that, and there's a couple of publishers who've published medieval English scientific materials, so I'm looking into maybe one of those. So hopefully at some point this will be a thing.
Great. We have a question that's come to us via YouTube from Neil MacDonald. I'm not sure how relevant this is to your work. And Neil's interested in the interchangeability of the words mind and spirit. And I wondered if that's something which comes up in your research. He says, can anyone comment on the significance of this in the context of modern interpretations? I assume he means modern interpretations of alchemy. I'm not quite sure. But mind and spirit, certainly there are lots of spirits floating around on the deep in Zoe's paper. And so maybe you'd like to, any comments you have there on mind and spirit?
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. They do seem to be two very distinct things. So I suppose the mind, you know, is a much more sort of introspective thing, and the spirit is a much more explicit chemical thing. You know, you're sort of extracting a spirit or an essence rather than, you know, sort of, you wouldn't do that sort of process with the mind. So I think there is a very clear distinction between those two things, and they're not really used that interchangeably from what I've seen.
Yeah, I mean, you get the kind of body, soul and spirit distinction, don't you, in early alchemical texts? I mean, Sara, I mean, does that kind of distinction play into the Mirror of Alchemy at all?
Not really. So at least I'm just trying to remember if even like the word mind turns up at all. Not too much, because I feel the Mirror of Alchemy is very focused on physical alchemy, so just like the pure working with the metals and the fire, that sort of level. It does mention spirits, but like Zoe said, they're more the sort of the spirits of, you know, that you're working with in the physical realm. So I'd say, yeah, the Mirror of Alchemy is quite a practical work in that sense. So doesn't really deal with mental things a whole lot.
Okay, any other last questions? We've got about another 4 minutes, so do you have time if you've been hoarding a question there, hugging it to your chest? I was interested in the Reasons Seminary too, Zoe. It's a bit of a pet interest of mine, the Rationis Seminales, because Pico della Mirandola's theory of magic is based on what he calls the actuation of seminal reasons. So there's clearly you know, quite an interest in that Augustinian theory of nature in these kinds of traditions, both in alchemy and in magic, in the late 15th and early 16th century. So interesting to see Michael Scott using that kind of language in relation to alchemy.
Yeah, certainly there does seem to be quite an interest in it. And again, I think it's sort of partially due to the receptiveness of the audiences that are consuming this sort of thing. You know, if it sort of fits into your own personal views of the world and your own thought processes, then kind of makes sense that those are the theories that you're going to keep coming across in varying contexts.
John, was your hand I saw going up a moment ago?
Yes, it's just a query to Sara, and it was about the title of the text, the Speculum. Now, Speculum is a very big genre, you know, the mirror of this, that, and the other, you know, preeminently maybe, I don't know, mirrors for princes and that sort of thing. And a mirror text is supposed to be what? A kind of advice text, a kind of manual, a kind of, you know, a mirror for princes is how to be a good prince. And it is a mirror for alchemists, how to be a good alchemist. I think that puts the question, really. Do you know what I mean? Yeah.
Yeah, that's a great question, actually. And it is something I looked at in my PhD. So there's this fantastic book on mirrors by Herbert, I think Grabers is how you pronounce his name. And I was definitely looking at that a lot. And I do think that the Mirror of Alchemy kind of conforms to the sense of mirror as a sort of compendium. So it kind of reflects the whole of the knowledge that we have on this thing, because like I sort of described in the contents of the Mirror of Alchemy, it does sort of seek to give you the basics. So there's like, okay, this is what alchemy is. This is what the metals are like. Here's how you make this is what sort of furnace and vessel you need to have. And this is how you transmute metals. So I feel it does attempt to be a very concise like thing that reflects alchemy as a discipline. So I do think it does try to at least tell you how to be a good alchemist in maybe a bit of an oblique way, but I mean, what text doesn't do that? And the Mirror of Alchemy is a bit like it definitely positions itself as being you know, easily understandable, and it's better than a lot of alchemical texts I've looked at. So so I do think it succeeds at being a mirror in that sense.
Yes, I thought it did as well from the excerpts you gave.
Yeah.
So thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Hey, we've reached the witching hour of 1835, so I probably think this is the moment to wrap this up, unless Jo has any different ideas. No, okay, well, in which case, can I ask everybody, including myself, to thank again Sara and Zoe for two very stimulating papers.
Yes, thank you, Sara and Zoe. And just a quick announcement before we end. For the next Turba meeting, it will be on 18th of March. And it will be quite a bit different. We will be discussing with Tina Asmussen, Tiana Uchats, I hope I pronounced that right, and Donna Bilek on their experimental attempts and kind of artistic attempts at understanding alchemy. And I hope you'll join me for that as well. So,
Jo, can I make a comment? Our time changes on the 13th in the United States. So I don't know if maybe that information, because I don't think your time changes then, does it? So we'll probably be maybe 1 o'clock or 11 o'clock. I don't know which, but in the States.
Yeah, I'll make sure I inform people of this. Thank you for mentioning that, because there is some kind of gap between when the US and Europe change times, so we have to be mindful of that.
I don't think summertime changes before the 18th.
I can't remember the date, but I think it's probably towards the end of the month.
I think so.
Yeah.
I think there's like a couple of weeks when there's no overlap between the US and Europe, and it makes everything a bit confusing.
Good question, though.
Okay, thank you again. Thank you for this wonderful session.
Thank you. Can I ask Sara one more thing?
Yeah, of course.
No, it's about Turku. Have you ever visited the Apothecary Museum there?
I have, yes.
It's the best apothecary museum I've ever visited, I think. You know, I had a very interesting time in it. And I thought, you know, as you were speaking, oh, you've probably wandered through the Apothecary Museum. Has it got the very good kind of cake cafe out the back still?
It does, yes.
That's the important part.
I'm actually, I live in Helsinki, but I'm actually going to Turku next week, and I think I need to go to the museum and also have some cake at the cafe. Thank you for reminding me of this.
Take a picture and send it to all of us, so we
I will.
know what that great cake is all about. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Good night, everybody.
And thanks for your talk, Zoe. It was really great.
Yeah, thanks you too. It's really
And I'm actually pretty inspired, and I might get back to you with some questions for the book that I'm writing, because religion and alchemy, fascinating.
yeah.
That's what it's all about, you know, cooperating and working together to advance the field. So
yeah, thanks so much for enabling this, Jo. It's super great.
Yeah, enjoyed it enormously.
Thank you all.
Thank you both.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Good night.
See you at the next one. Bye.
Bye.